What does it mean to have power and authority? And what sources do governments and regimes pull from to exert their power and authority? Today, we are looking at these concepts and then applying them to the AP Comparative Government course countries in terms of federal or unitary political systems. We will also be working on developing your comparative analysis skills to help you prepare for the AP exam. So, how do different governments and regimes control the people that they rule over? They are able to do this because they have authority and power over the people. This means that they have various forms of formal and informal influence that they use to control the population, so the population will fall in line and do what they say. Some of the most common sources of power and authority are constitutions, which are often referred to as formal social contracts between the regime and their people, agreeing to how they will be ruled. For example, what is the government allowed to do? And which rights do the people have? Legislatures are institutions that have formal authority to make laws that all people in a country are expected to abide by. We will learn more about these legislative institutions later in our AP Comparative Government course. The military can be used by the government to control people through force, such as China's military has been used, for example, at Tiananmen Square, to silence protesters and hereby control the population, or during military regimes like we have seen in Nigeria. There are also well-established political parties that can influence the public both informally through campaigns, but also formally when they are represented in the government or in the legislature. We will see one-party states like China, where the political party, the CCP, is a massive source of power and authority for the government. But also, we see Russia, where the president's dominant political party is a major source of power and authority. Many countries also count on popular support to bolster power and authority of the government or regime, because that means that the populations will actually go along with the government's decisions instead of being forced to, or instead of protesting against the government. And finally, we see that religion can be used to control the population. And we see this most notably in our course countries in Iran's Islamic theocracy. Now, to be very clear, most governments and regimes will actually use a combination of sources to maintain their power and authority. It's not just one or the other. For example, Iran's Islamic Republic might have religion as a source of authority, but it also has a constitution. So we see that there are different sources that the government, that the regime pulls on to control the population. So when you try to identify sources of power and authority, you need to look at the different ways in which people are being controlled by a government in that specific country. When these sources are used effectively, it can result in a more stable regime or government. But it is so important to keep in mind that what will be an effective way of maintaining stable power and authority in one country might not work as effectively to control the population in another country. Each country has its own political cultures and traditions that make it unique, which means different methods to control the population will work very differently in different contexts. We see countries with more democratic traditions built on citizen participation and freedom will need to depend more on popular support and constitutions with many citizens' rights. while other countries that have a more authoritarian tradition are more likely to accept being controlled by a government that uses more forceful sources to exert their power and authority. So, different countries have different powers, different sources of power and authority, but we also see that power and authority is divided differently in different countries and also in our different AP Comparative Government course countries. So here we are looking at how it is divided across the regions or how it might be centralized within the country. There are what we call unitary and federal systems, which are basically different ways of dividing the power throughout the country and are often done in response to different internal factors such as ethnic divisions or external factors such as influence from other countries. The way in which the power is divided into either a unitary or federal system can also change over time. It is not set in stone because there are changing internal and external forces. So it could be that a system becomes more federal over time or more unitary in response to changes in the country and outside of the country. What do these two terms mean? Basically, we say that a unitary system is characterized by centralized power, meaning that there is one government that retains the most power, the formal authority to make laws for the entire country. There will be less room for regional or local governments to make decisions in a unitary system. Federal systems, on the other hand, are characterized by decentralized power because the power is not all kept at the federal level. There is actual formal authority granted to regional and local governments in federal systems. So, which of the AP Comparative course countries are unitary systems? We have China as a strong centralized government is a unitary system. Yes, there are local governments, but all power resides with the centralized Chinese government. Iran also is a unitary system where the power is maintained by the centralized government. The UK is also a unitary system, but we're going to talk more about that one in a moment. What these unitary systems have in common is that we will see that policy tends to be more unified. There is less room for regional differences because the centralized government maintains all of the authority to override any local or regional decisions. Now, as I said, the UK is becoming more of an exception. Since 1997, they have been devolving power more to the nations within the UK. So while there is the British Parliament in London that reigns supreme over the entire United Kingdom, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland each have their own parliament and have been increasingly allowed to create and implement their own devolved policies. This has been actually quite evident since COVID, as each nation in the UK has had very different restrictions and lockdowns enforced at different points throughout the pandemic. And they have been allowed to do that. So there was a different lockdown with different restrictions in Scotland as opposed to England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So while the UK has devolved these greater levels of power to the nations, it still is considered to be a unitary state because the British Parliament does remain sovereign, which means the British Parliament reserves that right to revoke any decisions made by the devolved governments. This is different in our federal states in this course, Russia, Mexico, and Nigeria, because these courses actually distribute formal authority at the different levels of government. So those local governments are given real independence to make policies that suit their local needs, which cannot simply be overruled by the federal government. We see federal systems more commonly in large countries with diverse populations because it is an attempt to build more local legitimacy by allowing those local populations to create and implement policies that are more in line with their local cultures. So, for example, Nigeria, which is probably our most ethnically diverse, coarse country, has different laws in different states. Some of the states with larger Islamic populations have actually implemented Sharia law, while other states do not adhere to this Islamic law. So, it is important to remember that there is a lot more power and authority granted to the local and regional governments in federal systems, but that not all decision-making is left up to the local governments in these systems. Each country does still reserve certain power for the federal government. Now, for those of you taking AP Comparative Government, you are going to need to practice the disciplinary skill of country comparison. This means you will be asked to compare two or more course countries based on political systems, principles, institution, process, policies, behaviors, anything from our units. You will then be asked to either explain how similar countries are both similar and different. So you might be asked to explain how two countries with a federal system like Russia and Nigeria are both similar and different. They obviously will have similarities in the way they are federalist systems, but they each have their own unique way of applying it, like Russia being an asymmetric federalist system. Or you might be asked to compare similar unitary systems like Iran and China. But again, you need to explain the implications of both the similarities and differences when you are comparing. Comparing is not just looking at differences, it's also looking at similarities. Now, so both are unitary countries. What is reflected in both countries that makes them unitary? And also, what are the differences? What makes each unique in spite of the fact that they share those similar characteristics of a unitary system? But you might also be asked to explain implications of similarities and differences between countries that have different political systems. So, for example, you might be asked to compare a federal state like Mexico to a unitary state like the UK. And again, you would be asked that in spite of the fact that they have different political systems, what is still done the same in these two different systems? But of course, also, how are these different systems different? What makes them different? So that is what country comparison is about. You'll see it in free response questions and also in multiple choice questions. But today we're going to look a little bit more at those free response questions, also called FRQs, which are basically open questions on the AP exam. They are prompts telling you what to do, and each of these prompts has a task verb. Now remember, a verb is an action word. So these tasks verbs in an FRQ are telling you what action is expected of you as you answer the questions. These are the task verbs that are used in most FRQs in AP Comparative Government and Politics. The most simple is the identification. You would be asked to identify, just give information, no explanation required. So, for example, you might be asked to identify the course countries with a federal system, in which case you would just say, Russia, Mexico, and Nigeria have federal systems. You do not need to explain what federalism is when asked to identify these countries. You might also be asked to define a certain concept, which means you need to tell us what the word or concept means. So when asked to define power or authority, you write that power and authority is the ability to control others. again, we go from the most simple questions to the more higher order level questions. And we also have descriptions. You might be asked to describe, which goes a bit further than define because you also need to provide relevant characteristics. So if you are asked to describe power and authority, you would need to add that there are also sources which enable governments to control people, such as constitution, military forces, legislatures, popular support, and so on. Then there is explain, and you will be asked to explain a lot. And explain means that you need to show that you understand how or why something is the way it is. So, if you are asked to explain a source of Putin's power and authority, you might write that Putin is a strong president with a lot of power and authority because, here we are getting to the how or why, because Russia has a tradition of authoritarian rule. So the political elite backs their president by creating a system of rules to help manage and control the elections, which helps control the people. That word because is very important in that answer. We really try to encourage students when you are asked to explain to use the word because when answering these prompts because it connects the information given in the prompt to the reasons how or why something is, which helps you demonstrate your understanding by providing new evidence or reasoning. We've been looking at comparison as the country comparison skill, and you will have questions that do ask you to compare. They will typically be more specific by breaking it up into sub-questions when it is an FRQ. So you will get task verbs that have the request to describe or explain while comparing certain countries, and it will tell you often specifically which, but remember to look at similarities and or differences. If it does not specify just similarities or differences, do both. And just remember that you have those sub-questions, and it will tell you with the task verb to help you determine if you're supposed to describe or explain or define when comparing in these types of questions. Finally, draw a conclusion, which is really our most complex skill and one we'll see a lot more in data analysis, which we will practice in upcoming lessons. And here you need to use the information available, like a chart or a graph, and then formulate a statement that really reflects your understanding of the information you've been presented with. So you might be presented with data about perceived levels of democracy in different course countries. Perceived level of democracy, what does the population think about democracy in that country? So you might be asked to draw a conclusion, not just summarize the data. That would be describe the data. So it's not just say country X has this level of perceived democracy, but when asked to draw a conclusion, you need to connect that to what you have already learned about the course country. So for example, do people have the freedom of speech to openly discuss their perceptions of democracy? This might affect the data that you are presented with. So your conclusion to a question like that could be that the data from country X about people's perceptions is less reliable since the people there lack freedom of speech. So you look at whatever data you are presented with and you formulate an accurate statement, an accurate conclusion based on what you know about that country. Why am I explaining all of this? Now, for my students in this course, most of you are preparing for the AP exam, so you will have to answer these kind of questions. This week, you will be asked to do that. Your assignment for this week is to answer 2 free response questions. This is to practice for the types of questions you will see on the advanced placement exam. And we are specifically practicing comparative analysis this week. So you will be writing your answers on a separate sheet of paper, and remember to set your answers up like the prompt. Use the questions to formulate sentences that address each prompt. Any AP teacher will tell you, while yes, AP stands for advanced placement, when answering the exam, Keep in mind, address the prompt is also AP. Answer the question that is being asked. And to help you do so, use the question to formulate your answer. So, define a unitary system. You would write, a unitary system is. Describe how Great Britain has decentralized power since 1997. You would write, Great Britain has decentralized power since 1997 by, so on and so forth. Please also structure your answers as you see them in the question. So if there are sub-questions, then also label your sub-answers accordingly with A, B, C, D, and so on. If possible, also skip a line between each sub-answer to make it easier for the person grading your answers to read those and really assess them properly. Now, for my students, because we are just starting off the school year, in this assignment, I have underlined each task verb for you. This will not be the case as the year goes on, as you hopefully have learned to really zoom in on those task verbs. And also note sometimes there's more than one task verb, like here, which means you need to answer 2 prompts in a sub-question. On the AP exam, these will also not be underlined. So use it now to help focus on them, but know that in the future, you will have to learn to identify them without this extra tool to support you. Now, I hope that this has helped you today to learn a bit more about power and authority and how this can be divided in federal or unitary systems. And I wish you the best of luck as you practice your comparison skills. Remember, always address the prompt using the task verbs given.
Like this video. Subscribe for more lessons by Miss Mar.